I was 40 years old, right? Yeah, I was like right at 40 when I first realized my sight wasn't going to be the same for the rest of my life. I always prided myself in my eyes, because I could see really, really well. My daughter came to me, Heather, came to me with a splinter. Or maybe I went after her because she had a splinter, probably more likely. And I looked at it because I was a splinter guy. How many of you guys were a splinter person in your family? Yeah, it's like a designation. There's no training for it, but you're right for it, and you know it, and everybody knows it. So I went to her, and I played trombone for a minute with it, and there was no right distance. I could not see the splinter. This was before glasses. And I was like, at first, because your eyes have been good forever, you're thinking, oh, could it be a tumor? Because you're just used to having really good eyes. But no, this was just where things were going. And then I went to, our church had an optometrist. I went to him. He did all the tests. I got through it. And I said, well, it's not much, right? He said, no, they're not really bad, but you're going to need something. And I said, yeah, because reading is rough. I said, but my distance vision, I told the doctor, this is what we do, right? I said, my distance vision is fine. And he said, no. I thought, well, I think I can see everything. I'm looking at it and I'm seeing everything. But he's the doctor, so he ordered the glasses. 2 weeks, whatever. I went and I put the glasses on. I went outside and I looked around and I was like, oh, they're individual leaves. I had just kind of lost that ability to see that. Our vision is just really important to gathering information that helps us understand our world. And for that reason, vision and the ability to see and the attendant concepts of light and darkness were a metaphor that gave to the Apostle John. In fact, his work starts with a discussion about light and darkness and the various concepts that pull into that. Jesus came as light. He said he's the light of the world. But we're told in the early parts of John that men love darkness rather than light. So there's this battle. Men need light, they need vision, they need to be able to see, but there's something for them comforting about the darkness. And so they recoil from the light when it shines in their eyes. And you can imagine, you've probably read the book. This metaphor just keeps giving and giving and giving. And in sort of an opportune moment, John pulls in this discussion of light and darkness after Jesus has had the opportunity to give a blind man his sight. We read about that last week. So once again, the metaphor is going to continue to give, and there's a bit of an irony in the story and what happens because you have these seeing people that Jesus makes clear aren't seeing as well as they thought they were. And then you have this blind man who suddenly sees more than the seeing do, and so there's this juxtaposition, there's an irony in what happens with these parties. And as we worked through it last week, we really just laid out the story and what happened. Jesus healed someone not who just was blind, but who was born blind, and this probably is kind of important to the story. And then there's this discussion with people about who healed him and how this came about. But more detail follows in verse 13 and all the way through verse 41. And that's what we're going to read just a little bit at a time today as we consider the story and the fallout from the story, looking at a couple of ideas about the healing and a couple of interrogations that take place, and then the two effects of Jesus' miracle on those who were there. So let's just start reading in verse 13, and we'll go to, 17 or something. So they brought the man who used to be blind to the Pharisees. The day that Jesus made the mud opened his eyes was a Sabbath. Then the Pharisees asked him again how he received his sight. Well, he put mud in my eyes, he told them, and I washed and I can see. We read about that last week. Some of the Pharisees said, well, this man is not from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. Doesn't that read like the ultimate missing the point? Obviously. He doesn't keep the Sabbath. But others were saying, well, how can a sinful man perform signs like this? Let me help you with that. How can a sinful man do miracles like this if he's really sinful? And so there was a division among them, which we've come to expect anytime Jesus shows up, anytime Jesus teaches, anytime Jesus feeds people, anytime Jesus is on the side of a hill, anytime Jesus is in town, there's a division of people. The change, though, is that now it's not a division among the people who are just observing. Now it's a division among the religious leaders. So it's a division that just keeps giving. Verse 17. Again, they asked the blind man, well, what do you have to say about him since he opened your eyes? Well, he's a prophet, the man said. You're going to see this man sort of on a journey and his awareness increasing, almost like aperture, as his vision gets clearer and clearer standing there before everybody. Let's talk about a couple of ideas about the healing. And this takes us back to chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. I'm not going to reread that again, but you remember the story that we visited last week. And there are a couple of ideas about the healing that cash out of this story and this exchange, as we're going to see it in a minute. The first idea is that this healing of the blind man implicated Jesus as a sinner. Again, reads like a classic case of missing the point. But you can see where the dialogue goes immediately. Oh, he healed him on the Sabbath. I mean, it's like that. It's a gotcha game, which is what religion was like for the Jews. You know, for some people, religion is a gotcha game. Oh, you used what word? Oh, you went to what place? Oh, you drank what? Oh, you saw what movie? Oh, you wore what kind of clothes? It's a gotcha game. It was that way when I was growing up. Your hair is just a little bit too long. Gotcha! You're wrong again. There's all kinds of things you can do to be caught. And this gotcha game kind of comes up because they see Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath, heals a man on the Sabbath, and they say, oh yeah, but he did it on the Sabbath. So for them, the healing of the blind man, this good deed, actually implicates Jesus as a sinner. That's one idea. Another idea is that it vindicates Jesus as God's Son. In fact, what Jesus said when the disciples missed the point and they said, so who sinned that this man is born blind? What Jesus said is, you're missing it, guys. We must do the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work, and as long as I am in the world, I am, and here it is again, I am the light of the world. What Jesus says here is that this is an opportunity that God's works can be displayed before people, and God's works is an unfolding of God's will accomplished by the one God sent, who is Jesus himself, and all those things are tied together, and he's telling the disciples not to miss it. In one frame of mind, this good act of healing a blind man implicates Jesus as a sinner. In another frame of mind, it vindicates Jesus as God's Son, which really is the purpose of the miracles. And since we're in a section of the book of John that's often called the book of signs, chapters 2 to 12, and we're just about to leave it for too long, it's a good thing to talk about signs because the purpose of the signs, of course, that Jesus does and the miracles are to vindicate Jesus' claim that he's the Son of God. What's the theme of Jesus as he talks and gets him in trouble and over and over and over and over? I have come from my Father who sent me, if I can paraphrase. This is the phrase that pays, but it's also the phrase that gets Jesus in a lot of trouble. And the signs, of course, are offered as vindication that Jesus is who he said he was. There's also the use of signs in the Old Testament. The othoth, I know that's hard to say, but the miracles in the Old Testament were arrangements by God accomplished at the hand of his agents, known as prophets, that vindicate their claim to be speaking on behalf of God. You see these on both sides of Jesus in the Old Testament, but you're going to see it in the New Testament too. The apostles their ministry is marked by signs and wonders. This is the same word. Wonders just sort of emphasizes the fact that these are miraculous. And these signs and wonders served a purpose, I believe, in the past, because I like the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 2 says that these things happened in the past basically to vindicate the message of those who were giving those messages. So you see him kind of on both sides of Jesus, and certainly in the life of Jesus. And the point of these miracles was to vindicate Jesus' claim to be the Son of God. But it's interesting that sometimes the very miracle that is intended to validate the gospel message is used by those who reject it to further reject it, which just frustrates the evangelist to no end. There's no guarantee that the resurrection is going to be a lock argument with somebody that's going to bring them to Christ. We'll talk about that more in a moment. So there were these two ideas about the healing, and all of that is just kind of the setup for the discussion that follows here now. These two interrogations, though, we see in verse 13 through 34, and in verse 13 through 16, we saw this division of the Pharisees. Now, previously the crowd was divided, but now the religious leaders are divided, and that's where things get really dicey in Jerusalem. A lot of what people did in Jerusalem, they did because of, this is the phrase, fear of the Jews. And fear of the Jews means fear of the religious leaders. They were afraid of their authority, of their power, of their clout, of what they could do and how they could make their lives difficult. And so people responded in keeping with what they thought was in their best interests with regard to the power and the clout of the religious leaders of the day. So you got a couple of groups. The first group is characterized by rejection. These are the people who are saying he's not from God. These are the religious leaders. Now keep in mind, these are both groups of religious leaders. One group of religious leaders is saying he's not from God because he broke the Sabbath. And this is insidious. It's the gotcha game. By the way, Jesus didn't break the Old Testament law. He broke the oral expansions of the law. That's very important to keep in mind. Because the oral expansions of the law said, oh, well, if we're supposed to rest on the Sabbath, let's think about what things are not rest. And guess what one thing is not rest? Kneading. Like with clay or with Play-Doh. That's not rest. You might need to make bread. And that's not rest, so that violates the law. In some cases, spitting on the ground was considered to be violating the law because your spittle might move dirt. And moving dirt was considered to be work. Guess what else was not considered to be acceptable according to the law of keeping the Sabbath? Applying salve to somebody's eyes. That could be considered to be work because it's a healing art. Guess what else wasn't considered to be acceptable on the Sabbath? Healing. Because some people do it professionally. So Jesus broke, in their minds, at least 3 of any number of gotcha rules. And these are not rules from the Old Testament. These are rules from the expansions of the religious traditionalists of the day. And they have a gotcha moment now with Jesus. And their conclusion from all of this insidious take on religion is that Jesus clearly is a sinner because he broke my understanding of piety. Well, there's another group, though, and this is interesting. Besides the rejection group, you have sort of an indecision group. You do have some religious leaders who are listening to Jesus. Nicodemus, he came to him by night, right? Because probably didn't want a lot of people seeing this caucus. Nicodemus, a Pharisee, meeting with Jesus, asking spiritual questions. And so they met at night. We know that later there's Joseph of Arimathea. Jesus is buried in his tomb, and he was a disciple, but secretly for what? The phrase again, for fear of the Jews. I don't know exactly what that means about his faith, but that's not the point. The point is, there were these people among the religious elite who were either toying with or considering or investigating the possibility that Jesus was the real deal. And so now you see this tension among the religious leaders where somebody says, well, I see what you're saying about the Sabbath thing, but how can a guy do this if he's not really from God? And it's an interesting thing that they say. They say, how can a sinful man perform such signs? You know, this old tradition had been around for a long time that suggests that the pious can gain the ear of God. And that a sinful man he will not listen to. And there are a number of allusions in the Old Testament that sort of lay out this principle. And they're appealing to it here as just an accepted maxim among the Jews that God does not perform on behalf of the wicked. And so for these people to come along and say this man is wicked doesn't explain the fact that he can do these good deeds like healing somebody. So you have these very opposing positions of what's going on, and so the interrogation sort of begins with the division fully in place. In verses 18 through 23, you have the interrogation of the parents. Let's read that. The Jews did not believe this about him. And you know what? Fair enough, right? I mean, maybe they weren't there. I don't know exactly what was going on, but they didn't believe it. And so they begin to investigate. They didn't believe that he was blind and received his sight. I'm guessing these guys didn't know him. And so they're looking for evidence. But it says until they summoned the parents of the one who had received his sight. Interesting. Almost implies that they did come to believe it then. So they asked him, "Is this your son? The one you said was born blind?" You didn't know they had the British accents. They teach you that in seminary. "How then does he now see?" they say. They want to know what the parents are going to say about what happened. And they're probably hoping they'll toe the line because, after all, the real influence of the day was the fear of the Jews. So they're hoping that the parents are going to come along and say, "Oh, no, he wasn't born blind. No, he's been seeing for years now. Everything's fine. Just everybody calm down." And that's what they're hoping will happen. They said, "Well, we know this is our son." Well, that's impressive. "We know this is our son, and we know that he was born blind." So they're fully in the know about what happened with their son. Impressive. His parents answered, "But we don't know how he now sees, and we don't know who opened his eyes." They're giving cursory acknowledgement to the fact that a miracle has taken place. They're implying someone opened his eyes. He was born not being able to see. We don't know who it was. So they've already probably said more than the Jewish leaders wanted. They wanted them to say, "Oh, we think it was hysterical blindness, lasted for a number of years, but he's okay now, and no agent was involved." But they specifically indicate agency on the part of somebody who healed Jesus here. So anyway, they said, "Ask him, he's of age." He's of age? Well, he's probably of age in some legal sense so that he can speak on behalf of himself. He doesn't need to hire a lawyer. He doesn't need a court-appointed attorney. Just go to him and ask. You don't need us. And see what he says. They're pushing off this tense moment. They don't want to deal with the politics of the moment. He'll speak for himself. Verse 22. His parents said these things because, here's the phrase again, I hope you're getting a feel for what Jerusalem was like. It says that they said these things because they were afraid of the Jews, since the Jews had already agreed, get this, that if anyone confessed him as Messiah, he would be banned from the synagogue. And this is why his parents said, "He's of age, ask him." There was already this tension. By the way, some scholars consider this to be, on John's part, as the author, reading something back into the days of Jesus that was true only of John's day. Because they say expulsion from the synagogue was something that was really being discussed and really took place around AD 90. But the fact of the matter is, Jesus stood before the high priest at his own trial, and the high priest said, "Are you in fact the Son of God?" I mean, this tension over Jesus' identity and the claims that Jesus made were front and center from the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. And Jesus warned his disciples, you're going to be hauled into court. You're going to be facing legal assault because of your faith and because of your connection with me. There's really nothing unexpected about this at all. John tells us that the test was a confessional test. It says that the Jews had already, the word already is interesting because John's indicating that at this point in Jesus' earthly ministry, there was already this tension about confession with regard to the identity and the person of Jesus. So they knew that he could be banned from the synagogue. This is a very serious thing to the Jew. By the way, there are a number of ways to ban an individual. At least 3 have Talmudic description, and one of them is the kind of classic harem ban, where somebody is banned from any kind of connection with other Jewish people outside of their immediate family. But even those people were allowed to continue to practice their faith. This is a very serious ban where he'd be expelled from the synagogue. Now, by the way, this is probably a local issue. This is probably a local rendering on behalf of the blind man, not some kind of a universal legal rendering that he would no longer have any connection to Judaism. This was something that was happening just there. But this is why, verse 23 says, his parents said, he's of age, ask him. So the parents kind of distanced themselves. And you know what? It's easy to go, oh, that's terrible. On the other hand, they didn't have a lot of time to prepare for this. I mean, who would want to be put in that moment where, okay, so what are you going to do? Decide. Take your time. Give me your answer now. And that's where they were. Take all the time you want. Just answer right now. And so they were like, you know what? He's a grown man. You can ask him. And then the interrogation, of course, starting verse 24, goes to the blind man himself. There had already been a bit of an interrogation, but let's read what kind of cashes out starting in verse 24 to verse 34. I know that's a lot, but we'll make it. So a second time they summoned the man who had been blind and told him, "Give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner." That's a great phrase. This is really good. Give glory to God is not saying, now give us a testimony and glorify God, for what has happened. That's not what they're saying. They're saying, we know that Jesus is a sinner. Now do the right thing and fess up. Fess up that he's a charlatan, that he's a fake, that this didn't really happen. Give glory to God by telling the truth. It's a loaded statement. Well, he answered. He said, look, whether or not he's a sinner, I don't know. But one thing I do know, I was blind and now I can see. You know what he's saying? He's taking this discussion and putting all the stress back on them, saying, look, if you want to explain it, explain it. Here's the data. He's just throwing the data back in their faces. It's interesting to me, though, that he's starting from sort of a position of neutrality. They want him to confess something specific about the person of Jesus and his character, and instead he backs off and says, look, here's the raw data. I've been blind all of my life, and now I can see, so you connect the dots. Tell me what you can do with this moment. Starts out in this sort of position of neutrality. Then they ask him, verse 26, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? I already told you, he said, and you didn't listen. So why do you want to hear it again? Hey, you guys don't want to become his disciples too, do you? This is just insulting now. I mean, this guy is tired of the political assault. He's tired of being dragged into this for their own religious political purposes. And so he's just turning the moment on them and being sarcastic. Of course, he's angering them. So they ridiculed him. Verse 28, that's what you always do when you're losing an argument. It's called ad hominem. You're that man's disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but this man, we don't even know where he was from. Remember all this discussion about Jesus' origins, his provenance, where he hails from, where he comes from, tied, of course, to his questions of his identity. That discussion took place on a couple of different levels. At any rate, they ridiculed him. He said, you're a disciple of him, which this man, by the way, had not said. He had not claimed to be a disciple of Jesus. He hadn't gone there yet. He's just laying out the data. I can see now, I don't know what, you do what you want with that. But he assaulted them. They assault him by saying, you're a disciple of this unknown fisherman from Galilee or wherever he's from. But we're disciples of Moses. And they were disciples of Moses. They claimed the law, but unfortunately they expanded the law. People are good about that, taking the truth and expanding it to mean more than it ever meant. Churches are sometimes good about that too. Saying more than is actually there, making that the core of the faith, of the religion. Verse 30. Here's what I see. I see the man just getting bolder and bolder. And I think he's processing. I think this has happened really fast. I think as he hears himself rehearse the data and just sort of throw it out at the guys, he's becoming more and more aware of what's just happened. So he starts from this position of neutrality. Well, here's what happened. And look what he says now. They say, we don't know who he is. The religious leaders said, we don't know who he is. We don't know anything about him. Help us make sense out of this. And he says in verse 30, well, now this is just amazing. You don't know where he's from, but he opened my eyes. This sounds like an allusion to Jesus' claims that he came from the Father to me. Jesus has to be more than a guy. He's more than a sage. He's more than a mystic. He's more than some kind of itinerant, zealot or local philosophic teacher. There's more going on here. I was blind. I can now see. He claims to be sent from God. You say you don't know where he's from. And that's just amazing to me because he opened my eyes. Verse 31. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners. There's that idea again. Proverbs 15:29, we've all heard, he hears the prayer of the righteous. This is the feel of the Old Testament. God is close to those who are close to him, and he listens to their cry, and he hears their plea. And this man hails to that principle from the Old Testament and says, we know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he listens to him. Throughout history, no one has ever heard of someone opening the eyes of a person born blind. That may have happened in the past. This man wasn't familiar with it, and certainly not someone who was born blind. That has no precedent even in the Old Testament. Now he draws the conclusion, if this man were not from God, he wouldn't be able to do anything. It wouldn't work. So I see this guy moving from neutrality to at least curiosity. I would say even acknowledgement. Let's think about the people we know. That's the kind of conversation you want to have. People may start from a position, actually they may start from a position of rejection. That happens a lot. I get that. But you can't actually see people move to a position of neutrality if you spend some time with them, if they see your life, if they hear your testimony, if you give them the data that they need to work with. You can see them move from a position of rejection to neutrality. In our lifetime, there's a philosopher who's probably one of the best-known atheistic philosophers in the world, one of the most published, who before his death didn't become a Christian, but he moved from being an atheist to an agnostic because of the influence of Gary Habermas, a professor of Christian philosophy. Don't think it can't happen. Don't engage because you think it's an impossible job. It is with you, but there's more going on here than you. Have the discussions. Engage people at this level. I see this guy processing quickly and moving from neutrality to acknowledgement. But let's look at the two effects of the miracle. Verse 35 to 41, I'll read that, and we're getting ready to close as we run out of time. Verse 35. Jesus heard that they'd thrown the man out. He got excommunicated. Wow. So they did it. And he found him and he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Son of Man is an interesting phrase. John uses it, and in John and even in the Synoptics, Son of Man speaks. It hails from the book of Ezekiel, but also from Daniel. And for John and for Mark, Son of Man is the phrase referred to the one sent by God who comes in judgment and who comes representing God in the end times. It has certain apocalyptic overtones, end time overtones. It's messianic in character. And by the way, the man doesn't say, tell me what you mean by that. He understood in the milieu of the day and in the theological understanding of the day when Jesus said, do you believe in the Son of Man? He didn't say, well, tell me what you're talking here. What he says is, who is he, sir, so that I may believe in him? He understood something about the Messiah, about the Son of Man, about what Jesus was talking about. The Old Testament had talked about a time when God was going to send his appointed servant who would come and have an impact on the lives of people so that healing took place. Let me read you some of those passages. Isaiah 29, on that day the deaf will hear the words of God, and out of deep darkness the eyes of the blind will see. Isaiah 35. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Isaiah 42. This is my servant. I strengthen him. He's my chosen one. I delight in him. I put my spirit on him. He will bring justice to the nations in order to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from the dungeon, and those sitting in darkness from the prison house. This whole picture of Messiah coming and bringing deliverance and bringing healing and having power over debility and limitation and temporality is something that was born into their very understanding of who the Messiah would be and what it means that God would be sending his servant. And when Jesus looks at this man who just received sight for the first time and says, do you believe in the Son of Man? He's not in some kind of theological crisis. He just says, help me understand who we're talking about. Because the times were rife with expectation. There were people claiming to be the Messiah, and those didn't work out so well. Then Jesus came and nobody knew what to do with him. They didn't know how to respond. Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? Jesus said, you've seen him. You have seen him. You haven't seen much yet, but you've seen him. In fact, he's the one who's speaking with you. I believe, Lord, he said, and he worshiped him. I think he moves from neutrality to this kind of curious acknowledgement, finally to confession. It was a quick process on his part. He had certainly a dramatic moment to sort of reflect on, but please, as we leave today, keep in mind that the people that we have opportunities with are in a process. And it's not always easy to figure out where they are. You know what? Let's be honest. Sometimes they don't know where they are. I've been there. I'm putting things together. I'm assessing. I'm trying to figure out what I'm seeing and what I'm reading and what I'm thinking. And it takes time. Be patient with them and have the conversations and understand, at times engage, but Christians at times back off and give them some time to process. I wish I could be the master communicator like Jesus. Bottom line is, I'm not. And there are times when I need to back off. I believe, Lord, he said, and he worshiped him. Two effects of Jesus' presence. One is judgment. Look at verse 39. I came into this world for judgment, in order that those who do not see will see, and those who do see will become blind. There's that reversal that I talked about. It's interesting because Jesus said, I didn't come into the world to judge the world. But he came into the world so that the world might be saved, to bring life and to give hope. But there's a certain byproduct of light coming into the world. Those who prefer darkness rather than light recoil and run to the recesses where the light can't pervade, and then their judgment is made more sure and more certain. There's a certain judgment that's just inherent to the hope that comes to those who will receive it. And what Jesus is saying here is not in contradistinction to what he said before about not coming to judge the world, but he's saying that there's a certain yield of the light coming into the world, and that's the judgment on those who run to the darkness and prefer the darkness. Jesus had so many things to say about that. In Matthew 6, he said, if your eye is bad, the whole body will be full of darkness. And if the light within you is darkness, then how deep is that darkness that you contend with? Jesus realized what he was dealing with in the tendency of the man to prefer darkness over light, and the result of bringing the light into a dark room, and what would happen is some would abandon and run and hide. So one of the effects of Jesus' presence is judgment, but another effect is illumination. Notice there's two groups that Jesus speaks to. There's those who are lost and know it, and then there are those who are lost and don't know it. And he refers to them in just a moment. That's the same opportunity we have. We'll talk to those who are lost and have a sense of it. I have time to go here, but that's one of the reasons I enjoyed ministry inside the prison walls. I never had to sell depravity. I never once had, there was one guy, I do remember one guy, strange guy. I had 1,000 guys in my unit, the maximum security unit. And I virtually never had to sell anybody that they were sinners. I mean, there are great discussions about depravity and its extent and what it does and its yield in humanity and individual lives. But everybody understood the reality of sin. And then you get on the outside and people go, I don't know what you're talking about. I kind of got it together. I think I'm doing fine. I think I'm okay. There are those who are lost and don't know it, and Jesus refers to them as blind, whether they can physically see or not. But we do have opportunity with people who are blind and do know it. And of course, those are the real opportunities that we have. The two effects of the miracle involved new sight for the blind, first of all. Let's read verse 40 and 41, and I'll wrap this up. So some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and asked him, hey, we aren't blind too, are we? After Jesus' comment. And Jesus said, if you were blind, then you wouldn't have sin. In other words, if you realized that you couldn't see and you could confess the fact that you couldn't see, and there was a degree of spiritual humility, he said, then you wouldn't have this sin. What is the sin? It's singular, by the way. This isn't plural sin. The sin is unbelief. It's the same, it's what we call the unpardonable sin. People say, well, if I committed the unpardonable sin, are you rejecting Christ? Are you living in unbelief? Rejection. No. Well, then you haven't committed it. This is what John calls the sin unto death. It's the sin that results in death because it's ultimate rejection of Jesus Christ as who he claims to be as the Savior of the world. Jesus says, if you were blind, if you admitted your blindness, then you wouldn't have sin. But now that you say, I have my sight, your sin, singular, your disbelief, your rejection remains. Two effects of the miracle is new sight for the blind. The blind were able to see, and this man confessed Jesus as the Son of Man, and he worshiped him, but also confirmed the blindness of those who were seeing, verses 40 and 41. And this claim to sight of theirs, by the way, is a rejection of their spiritual need. To claim to have sight, even though they were spiritually blind, is their own claim to have no spiritual need whatsoever. And it's also an incorrigible religious commitment that can't consider Jesus. It's a disposition that says, I have spiritual truth, I'm not open to any other possibilities, and I don't want to talk about anything, even if Jesus healed this blind man. I'll find a way to make his good work evil. I'll find a way. It is incorrigible. It is blind. And sometimes we, as believers, have these conversations, and someone will say something like that to you. It doesn't matter if he healed the blind man. I'll find a way to make that good work evil. And we go, what? It just seems weird, the responses to the gospel. But that is what blindness is. It's not rational. It's not logical. And this is why Paul wrote, the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Vision begins with light. And Jesus is the light of the world. Our job is not to give people their sight. It's to take them into the light so they can see.